be sharing that. So just a little bit about Rachel. Rachel has been a prosecutor for the Maricopa County Attorney's Office for 29 years. For 25 of those, she has worked in the areas of crimes against children and sexual assault. Rachel teaches prosecutors and other professionals nationally and across Arizona in these areas. She also chairs the Governor's Children's Justice Task Force and works on legislation. She's also received a number of statewide and local awards. And the Prosecution Integrity Program that she works in works with defense organizations outside the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, as well as prosecutors within our office to review and address items of integrity and conduct. So please help me in welcoming Rachel, and she is a co-host, so I'll hand it over to Rachel.
Good morning. So I bet I'm one of the more unusual guest speakers you've had at the Registrar of Contractors. So if not, we'll see. This actually came up during this idea during the height of COVID, if you will, but it continues to this day, and the usefulness continues to this day. So if you could turn up your volume as much as possible, I think it's going to be a little bit hard to see here. But this is a video talking about, at the height of COVID, the issue.
Not all kids in America are safer at home. With schools closed, experts are worried that child abuse is now going unreported. NBC News Now correspondent Alexa Lioto checks in with the director of the National Children's Advocacy Center.
It really is a pandemic within a pandemic that we're facing here in America. A lot of states have talked about safe at home or safer at home types of situations, and that's great for a lot of families. But unfortunately, for some children, being safe at home is a dream, not a reality. And in this situation, we have children that are in homes where they're experiencing abuse. And they don't have any mechanism to be able to tell what's happening.
What drops are you seeing in child abuse reporting?
If you compare January and February of 2019 to January and February of this year, they were right on par, right? And so we had these trends that were very similar, very consistent reporting. And then when it comes to March and it comes to April, you see this dramatic drop, especially when you look at April. That's where we see these declines of anywhere from 40 to 70% during that month of April. In April, what was happening? Kids were not in school. Kids were at home. They were not able to leave. And that's why we believe this significant decline. So what we're seeing around the country is declines anywhere from 40 to 70% in reporting. And what we're seeing in our own community has been right at exactly a 50% decline in the number of reports to Child Protective Services and to law enforcement during this time.
So that's what we were seeing across the board, across the nation, and really in other countries, is this dramatic decline. And it's really not hard to figure out why that was happening. The number one reporter, which would be out of the schools, aren't laying eyes on children. And as we heard during the height of the pandemic, kids were just kind of dropping off the map. And so I did what a lot of people did when I was working from home. The county attorney's office pretty much went home and worked there for months and months, was I got some work done around my house. And if you need an electrician, I heard somebody say that earlier, Dennis Parker, who he and his wife are personal friends of mine, came out and was doing some electrical work for me. And he knows me and he knows, what I do. And we were talking and he was telling me about some of the houses that he's been in. He told me about one house that was so filthy and smelly and disgusting that the electrician with him actually had to go outside and vomit in the yard. And there's people living in that house. He also told me about a situation where he was called by the landlord to go in, and I guess it involved fixing an outlet, and he had to move the couch. And there were two kids kind of passed out on the couch. And when he pulled the couch out to access the outlet, they didn't move. And he was talking to the mom about it, and she was saying, "Oh, I give them melatonin to keep them that way." So I started thinking, I'm like, well, gosh, we don't have teachers looking at these kids. We don't have churches looking at these kids. But we do have electricians, plumbers, cable repair people, all sorts of people that have to be in the house seeing things that really even schools may not see. That school's not going to see how filthy the house is. So Jeff Fleetum and I know each other, and I gave Jeff a call and I said, hey, is there any way that we could get word out to your people on how to report abuse if they see it in the houses? And he said, yeah. He said, but I would like it to be bigger than just child abuse. I'd like it to be vulnerable adult abuse as well. And I said, let's throw in domestic violence too. And so what we ended up doing was, looking at who the typical mandatory reporters are, realizing none of these people are going to be seeing these children. They're not participating in like YMCA type stuff. They're not going over to their friend's house. A lot of times they'll tell their friends and the friends will tell the parents. So, we looked at all of the problems making matters worse. Obviously, there's a huge financial strain that's still going on with some families who are out of work or not working as many hours. There are no outlets for stress. Those normal things that we do to keep our lives, healthy balance. We know that there was a huge increase in alcohol and drug use during this time. We know there was a huge increase in depression, suicide attempts. And then there's also, for a certain class of child abuser, there's less fear of detection. Because I can beat my child and my child's not going to go to school for anybody to see the bruises or whatever. So, there was really a situation. So what we wanted to do was give contractors the ability, the understanding to make those reports if they're in the house. Dennis, he knows me, he knows other people who work in the field, but most contractors aren't in that situation. So Jeff agreed to run an article last September, and then it ran again this October, called Doing Your Part While Doing Your Job. And it boils it down to very simplistic terms. We don't get hyper technical legal. And it basically says this is what child abuse is. It's, injuring a child, being sexual with a child. It's not reasonable discipline. It includes having a child in a drug house, dangerous situation. Not only where they're manufacturing drugs, but also where they're leaving drugs, where children could easily access them. I know of a situation where law enforcement went into a house and they were literally cutting fentanyl on the high chair tray. And we know how little fentanyl it takes to kill an adult. Think of a baby in a high chair. So that would be child abuse. But of course, like Jeff said, it's not just children, it's vulnerable adults. And that can be elderly people, but it can also be people who have either a developmental disability or they have a physical disability and they rely on a caretaker. And so they obviously are tragically huge targets for abuse. So having somebody like that or a child live in a house that's so filthy or uninhabitable, where, you have rotting food, roaches, dog and cat feces all over the floor. Many of your contractors probably have been in houses like this. I know I've gone out in houses like this, and they are disgusting beyond belief. They may also see a situation where there's neglect, where the person is not providing the basics of life, either to a vulnerable adult or a child. So the basics of life are the basics of life: food, water, clothing, shelter, supervision, and medical care. And then, of course, I know the Registrar of Contractors is very familiar with some examples of exploitation of vulnerable adults. I know that when I worked out in the Mesa office, we had a case involving the Irish travelers. And since we're talking about them, let me just say, yes, I know my last name is Mitchell, but no, I am not related to them. I learned that when I was working on that case, and I'm like, wow, not my relatives. Anyway, but there are other financial exploitation examples as well, besides, just ripping somebody off for home repairs. It can also be, controlling their bank account and just draining it to where the person doesn't have the money they need to have care taken of them. So those are things that people who are in the house have a unique perspective, unique ability to see that, like I said, even teachers and churches necessarily don't have. So we want to empower those people. What do you do when you see that? Do you just walk away and have it really bothers you, but you don't know how to act on it? So we included in the article what to do. So this is the DCS hotline to report child abuse. But we also recognize, and I work with a lot of churches and schools, we recognize for some people, it's hard to pull the trigger sometimes. Sometimes they're like, well, I think this is really bad, but I'm just not sure. And I really would hate to accuse somebody of something if it's not real. And so we reached out to Child Help USA and said, can we list your number? And that's what the second number is, 422-4453. So that if somebody's just not sure and they want to talk it over with somebody, can they call you? And Child Help USA said, absolutely, we'll talk. We're happy to take those calls. And then, of course, how to report vulnerable adult abuse. This is the number for Adult Protective Services. And of course, you're always welcome to call the police. Certainly, if it's an emergency situation, I would suggest you call the police. And then domestic violence, again, you can call police. But if you're not sure, if you just want to talk it over with somebody, here's the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And you can call and talk to them about, here's what I saw. What do you think I should do? Couple concerns that I hear when I'm teaching out there is, are they going to know it's me? Because there may be a contract. You may have to go back into that situation. They may be a regular customer. And you can call DCS or Adult Protective Services and not give your name. Or your name can be withheld and kept confidential. That's not true with law enforcement. They're going to ask you your name because you're going to be potentially a witness. But you can do that with DCS and APS. And then people will say, well, what if it turns out to not be true? Well, the law actually says that you're immune from liability if it's false, unless you do it in bad faith. So if you do it to get back at somebody and it's false, but otherwise you are immune from liability. So that's basically what we've provided people. But I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of sort of your non-traditional reporters and what they've been able to do. This just happened 4 days ago now, where a girl who had been transported from North Carolina and they were up in Kentucky. So think how far, that's quite a drive. And she was looking at people in cars that they were near when they were driving. And she gave the sign that's being taught on TikTok as the sign for help. And what that is holding your palm up, putting your thumb inside your palm and closing your fingers around it. And a driver in another car saw that, recognized it for what it was, and called the police. Obviously, we're not asking people to intervene themselves. That could be dangerous. And then this is another situation that happened a few years ago, but it's still regularly on Facebook. I see it. And it's just a really incredible video, if you look it up, where a woman has been held for 2 days by her boyfriend, and he finally lets her out with the dog. He comes along with her. That's what they do. They isolate and then they control to the veterinarian, and he goes into the room with the dog, and she actually slips this note to the veterinary office staff, who calls the police, and the guy is arrested. So people who are not mandatory reporters, who don't work with children or abused people, can make a huge, huge difference. And I'm so grateful for Jeff and the Registrar of Contractors being willing to partner in this thing. And like I said, even though COVID, we're kind of not at the height of it like we used to be, but there are still people who are very isolated. Even though children are back in school, we still have vulnerable adults and elderly who don't get out. And so you can be the eyes that see and maybe the person that saves these people. So that's all I have. If there are any questions.